For early access plus exclusive content, facilitated discussions, live one-on-one Q&As, and more, become a patron at patreon.com/BrucePointset. Welcome back to the Blacktastic Adventure. I'm your host, Bruce Pointset. And on today's episode, I speak with Walidah Imarisha. Walidah Imarisha is the co-editor of Octavia's Brood, science fiction stories from social justice movements, and her book, Angels with Dirty Faces, 3 Stories of Crime, Prison, and Redemption, won a 2017 Oregon Book Award. She spent 6 years with Oregon Humanities Conversation Project as a public scholar facilitating programs across the state about Oregon Black history and other topics. Imarisha currently teaches in Portland State University's Black Studies Department and is the director of the Center for Black Studies. You know, this interview is really very much like a full circle thing for me, because I remember one of the first organizing actions I went to was a Troy Davis rally coming out of, or one of the first actions I should say I went to coming out of college was a Troy Davis rally in downtown Portland. And, you know, I think it was very much helped shape basically where my mind would be as far as moving towards working towards abolition, getting involved and taking an interest in organizing and covering organizing. And, you know, some of the most, you know, pivotal things, in addition to being just among people around, you know, the cause of the unjust, you know, the death penalty going against Troy Davis, as well as just abolishing the death penalty and, you know, just being together again with the people. But it was also just some of the things I saw. And one of the things that stuck with me was actually Walidah, who I didn't know at the time, but it was just, you know, I saw this person, you know, with the joke with her about like the Angela Davis, like afro and the bullhorn, you know, directing traffic and, you know, really just putting this all like the prison industrial complex and this system into perspective. And it was just like, I knew I was in the right place. And it's just like between that, you know, seeing people from like Zulu Nation and whatnot. And it was just like, you know, that became just like a really important moment in my growth. So, you know, our paths have crossed a lot of times since then. I was working as a reporter, working now in sort of more organizing spaces. And, you know, we've collaborated on a few things. You know, like I said, I've interviewed her before, but this was just really a great time to, you know, even after 10 years, I'm still, you know, learning new things. And, you know, she's someone I'm proud to call a friend. So without further ado, let's get into this interview. I think you're really going to enjoy it. Check it out. So Walidah, thank you for being on the Blacktastic Adventure today. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me, Bruce. I'm excited for our Blacktastic adventure.
Absolutely. It's funny, you know, I tell people about like why I do this series, and a lot of the story kind of revolves around, you know, traveling around the state with Intizar, doing, you know, State of Black Oregon for the Urban League. But, you know, another, I think, big inspiration is just like the presentations you've done traveling around the state. And, you know, you have like a way, because I've seen you do it in LO and West Lynn in presentations I've been to, where, you know, Walidah's coming to town and like, you know, the Black community doesn't, or, you know, the fragmented Black communities in these places, maybe we don't come out for other things, but we will, like, that becomes like a gathering spot. So it's like, you know, I don't know, it's this interesting dynamics of Oregon. But yeah, I mean, and I've told you this before, and I think I've said in the speech, but just, you know, like there are formal mentors and informal mentors. And I think you've been like a real, you know, informal mentor for me. And we're going to talk about kind of why some more in the email or in the interview, but just, you know, like the way you've moved kind of like sort of like ideas specifically around like abolition and like visionary fiction that, you know, I feel like you've been one of the prime people as far as like introduced me to, and just like changing the way you're thinking or changing the way, you know, we think about things and approach things. So, you know, I just wanted to say first off that, you know, I just really appreciate all you've done around that. And, you know, creating kind of like that model and template for people like me. So, you know, yeah, I don't have a emotional moment at the beginning. I didn't plan that out. I'm sorry.
Oh, thank you so much, Bruce. That means so much to me. I'm, so appreciative for the incredible both community work and intellectual work you do here, and so happy to be in community with you. And whenever you're there, I'm like, all right, this is going to be great. I'm glad Bruce is here. So, that just means the world to me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That means a lot. So, one of the things I like to do with this, just kind of like, the Blacktastic Adventure is a little establishment of, place in Oregon, right? So, right now you're in Portland, but I guess can you just talk about like your upbringing as far as like, I know you've lived in different places around the world and you were in, I want to say Springfield, correct? Can you just talk about that and, what kind of like brought you, I guess to Portland eventually?
Sure. Yeah. And I appreciate that. And, I always try to be clear with folks that, Portland is, and Oregon specifically, is the place I've lived the longest, but I'm definitely not, I wasn't born here. And I do think that's important to be honest with that, and make sure that we're centering the voices of, especially of Black folks who are from Portland. And so I grew up on military bases, mostly overseas in places like Iceland and Germany. And then I moved to Springfield, Oregon to finish out high school. And then I came to Portland to do my undergrad at Portland State. I left for a number of years and then I came back. So I've had my own Blacktastic adventure. But, I think my politicization definitely happened here in Oregon. And part of that is the racial demographics here. So while I grew up in places like Iceland and Germany, which are overwhelmingly white, I grew up on military bases, which, because the military disproportionately recruits folks of color, are disproportionately Black and brown. So the communities that I went to school in and, shopped in and spent a lot of my free time in were Black and brown communities. So moving back to not only the United States, but to a place like Springfield, Oregon, it was a huge culture shock for me. And at the time, there was a lot of racial attacks happening against folks of color in the high school that I was going to, and a lot of animosity from white people towards Black and brown folks that I just, I didn't understand because, at the time as a high school student, I was just like, where is this coming from? Like, we didn't do anything to y'all. What is happening? And I was lucky enough to have a sort of undercover radical teacher in high school who slipped me books like Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States and Leron Bennett's Before the Mayflower and Ronald Takaki's Through the Looking Glass. And so, really understanding the historical context of the United States and the institutional systemic ways that race and power have functioned definitely changed my life in the course of everything. And then I was lucky enough while I was still in high school to hear a presentation by Dr. Daryl Milner, who was teaching at Portland State's Black Studies Department, who's one of the founders of it, one of the preeminent experts on the history of the Black experience in the West. And his presentation on Oregon Black history just, really blew my mind and, set me on the course that I am today. So I feel like even though living in Springfield as a young Black teen was not, I wouldn't recommend it. I was lucky enough to encounter, other youth and then adults who were helping me to figure out and understand the political landscape, and specifically to empower me to engage in it. I was lucky enough to start an internship at a organization called CALC in Eugene when I was still in high school. And so I got to learn about social justice movements and organizing, and that opened me up in a whole different way. So it's kind of, I definitely wouldn't be who I am without the experiences that I had there, good and ill.
That's one of the things I love about doing these interviews, like we've known each other for almost a decade now, and I didn't know we had just that other thing in common as far as just like being put on like in, you know, specifically to like Lerone Bennett at like a young age. Cause, you know, I had a teacher in, you know, 8th grade who was kind of like similar in that way of just like, you know, I wouldn't say like slipping me the books, but just like, you know, like I had an opportunity to do, you know, an essay where I was just talking about, it was kind of weird that they keep calling people half breeds in this book called The Wild. Can we talk about that? And she's like, she knows that, and, you know, we have more of a conversation and just like, you know, she really like supported me in my like, you know, quote unquote, like radical thoughts and musings and, you know, alternative essay ideas. And I think it was just, you know, like you said, it's invaluable having people like that in your lives, especially like in these places where, you know, whether you're thinking like Springfield, Eugene, for, you know, Lake Oswego, where, you know, you may not think of like, oh, these people are there, people who are going to like support you in that way are there. So yeah, it's really, yeah, it can just be, again, just so important and so, you know, honestly like life changing. But you know, you talk about PSU, and now you're back at PSU, except as the head of Black Studies. Uh, yeah, can you just
No,
say
I'm not the head of Black
not the
Studies.
head? Okay, yeah, yeah. So let's clarify. You have a new, very influential position at PSU. Can you correct me, please, first off?
Yeah. I want to be very clear because the department chair is Dr. Ethan Johnson, who is doing a great job for Black Studies. But so I'm an assistant professor in Black Studies, and I'm the director of the Black Studies Center, which is the Black Studies Department's research center. So I am a director of the research center that our department has.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah. And can you just talk about, you know, one, like what that role is and, you know, what it means for you, again, as, you know, someone who went through PSU, has been, you know, an adjunct professor there for a while, you know, what it means to be in this position now.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely feels kind of like coming back to my academic home. I did my undergrad at Portland State University, and at the time, Black Studies didn't have a major. They just had a minor and a certificate. And so I was majoring in history because I've always been fascinated with history. But honestly, I don't think I would have graduated Portland State without the Black Studies department, without being able to go and take those classes, because many of the classes at the time that I was taking in the history department, you know, completely erased the experiences of folks of color, or distorted it in, you know, really horrific ways. And it was through going through the Black Studies department and taking these classes, and basically I took everything in Black Studies that I, you know, could take, especially all of the history courses, because, you know, I knew that the education I had received was so lacking. And that was really the first, you know, institutional educational space where I was able to get a full understanding of the real history of not just the United States, but the world. So, you know, to me, Black Studies at Portland State, and I know for many of us, has been so important because it is a space where you can go and you can go into these classrooms and know that you are going to not only receive information that is that reflects you in an accurate way, but also to just know that you are not going to have to kind of go in armored up. I know a lot of students, not just at Portland State, but everywhere, are going into these situations, students of color, feeling, you know, like they're either going to have to, you know, basically try and correct other students or even the professors. And really recognizing that's not the job of a student. You're paying an exorbitant amount of money. You should not have to feel like, okay, I'm going to have to be the one to figure out how to set the record straight when you might not have all of that information yourself. So, you know, for me, Black Studies at Portland State specifically has always been my real academic home in my sort of essence and heart. And so I've taught at a lot of different places and a lot of different great places. I've taught at Stanford and Oregon State and Pacific Northwest College of the Arts, and have really enjoyed it. But coming back to this position, coming back to Black Studies, feels like coming home.
Yeah, and listen, can you just talk a little bit about like as far as like what the new position entails?
Sure. So, I mean, I'm so part of the time I'm teaching classes, like a normal professor, and really excited about the classes I'm teaching are really focused on my areas of study and expertise. So, this past year I got to teach Black science fiction. Coming up, I'm teaching a history of the Black Panther Party class. I'm teaching race and the history of incarceration. I'm teaching Oregon Black history. So really getting to bring all of this work I've done and research and other teaching into the classroom. And then with being the director for the Center of Black Studies, the goal for the center is really to provide opportunities and support for students to engage in meaningful research projects that are deeply connected to and engaged with community. And so I think of the Center for Black Studies as a way of sort of creating more connections with communities off campus as well, because the reason that the Black Studies department exists is because of organizing, by students, by faculty, by staff, and specifically from the Black community in the 1960s and 70s. The reason it existed and survived is because of that support on and especially off campus. And so, I think it's incredibly important to honor that and to be creating as many possibilities and opportunities for Black studies and the larger university to be supporting the incredible organizing and intellectual and academic work that's happening specifically in the Black community and in the larger community.
And I think, PSU definitely especially has, a reputation as far as just like being involved in the community or having people who, are involved with the community. I just, I talk with parents now and, students in different programs, and some of them are, considering going to PSU. And, one of the first things they talk about is just like, yeah, because of, like they have this presence in the community, or this like, this sort of like, I guess, sort of like organizing community within PSU that, they want to be a part of. And now, the added effect could be like, yeah, also, Walidah's there. Like, cool. Like, Walidah's there. Lisa Bates is there. Like like there's some, because part of it, I think, is always, the resources and the facilities, but then, actually like the faculty who's there, the staff who's there, like, you know, like you said, like it's part of the, I don't know, like I went to school in Eugene, and just like part of it was having access to, like a university library. It was amazing in itself. But then also, having the people who can also help guide you, people you can go to, people who understand, is crucial. So, you know, again, congratulations on, I guess, just furthering that tradition at PSU. And one of the things you talked about was doing Oregon Black history. I want to kind of transition to your Oregon Black history program that you've been doing. How many years has it been now?
I think it's nine, maybe almost 10 years.
9, 10 years, yeah. And you mentioned Daryl Milner, who I think you said before really, inspired you to do that. But can you just talk about the program and like how it started? And I got some more questions about it, but you just talk, like I said, you're approaching possibly like a decade now or more. What made you say, I want to go around the state of Oregon. I want to go to, Astoria and tell people about all the things that make white people sad, you know.
That's how I should bill it. That's how I professional sad white maker. No, yeah. So, I mean, like I said, Dr. Daryl Milner was foundational in my coming to this information. And, you know, I was incredibly lucky to hear a presentation by him when I was still in high school, knowing that, and that was also the first time I knew there was a Black Studies department somewhere in Oregon, because up until that point, I had no idea. And that is the main reason that I applied to Portland State, is because I did want to go to a Black Studies department, and having seen Dr. Milner's work, I was like, I clearly need to learn from him and everyone else who is there, because they're probably amazing. So, you know, that was a big part of me going through that program. And then, you know, as you said earlier, I started adjuncting, teaching part-time as faculty in Black Studies at PSU in 2008. And at the time, there was just starting a program called the Conversation Project, which is run by Oregon Humanities. And so they had an open call out for people to submit proposals to facilitate interactive programs around specific kind of issues. And so I submitted one around alternatives to incarceration, and it was accepted. And so I did that for a year, and it was very positive. And then the next year they opened it back up for more programs. And so I actually spoke to Dr. Milner and was like, you should propose one on Oregon Black history, because, you know, they pay you to go around the state. And he's like, yeah, you should do that. And I was like, oh no, I said, you should do that. He's like, yes, you should do that. And I was like, he's like, I've done that. I'm still doing it. But, you know, he was like, I think you should take that mantle up and be part of doing that work. So yeah, I applied to do it and got accepted. And so as part of it, developed the prototype of the Oregon Black History Timeline, which is a tool I use to engage in interactive conversations with participants around Oregon Black history, which of course is Oregon history, and the history of race, identity, and power in the Northwest and in the nation. And so, you know, that program has developed and grown over the years, but I'm still doing it in different ways. After 6 years, I stopped doing it with the Oregon Humanities Conversation Project, just because, you know, after 6 years of kind of continuously traveling around the state, I was like, okay, I'm tired, and I don't want to keep doing it like this. But even after that, I did get to work with Oregon Humanities and the Rural Organizing Project, who worked together to plan 2 tours for me, where I went out and for a specific time period, 2 or 3 weeks, did a rural tour of Oregon with my program. So, you know, wasn't going out constantly, you know, week after week, but still was engaging. And, you know, am hopeful for something like that, you know, in the future, when we're actually post-pandemic, which is not now. But yeah, so, you know, I think there are so many experiences and lessons from traveling around the state. You know, I've done the program hundreds of times at this point for probably tens of thousands of people. And, you know, if you can name a small town in Oregon, chances are I've either been there or near there and been doing this program. So yeah, there's a lot there.
And you talk about lessons, like, in terms of, I guess, what maybe has surprised you most about, you know, like before you started basically, you know, just touring around the state, like what has, as far as like lessons gleaned from those experiences, yeah, what has surprised you most about doing this?
I guess maybe I'll start with the positive. I think, I was utterly unprepared for the overwhelmingly positive response to the program. The first time I did it was actually here in Portland. I can't remember, it was at one of the library branches. I think maybe in Southeast. I can't remember which one now. But the room had a capacity of 50 or 60 people, and they met that, and then they were turning people away. And then the second time I did it was at the North Portland Library branch. And they have the upstairs room, which is huge, and I think the capacity is over 100 people. And they also had to turn people away. And then the first time I did it, and so I was like, well, maybe it's just Portland. And so then the first time I did it in a rural location outside of Portland, it was the same. And it's consistently been that same. The vast majority of my events have been over full, if not just full. And, I think that is a huge part of that, is because the information I'm presenting is not available publicly. It's not being taught in schools at this point in a organized fashion. It's not part of mandated curriculum in Oregon. It's very hard to access this information publicly. I think over the years, through the efforts of many, many people, yourself included, this information is becoming more accessible, but it's still not widely known. I consistently and continually meet so many people who are like, I grew up here in Oregon, and until today, I had no idea about how deeply embedded white supremacy is in this place, and these specific, things like the Black exclusion laws that, happened here. And so, I think, I try to make the program as engaging as possible, but I think that the biggest lesson is that we need as many spaces as possible for not only this history to be taught, but an understanding of the impact, the living legacy of this history. I really don't like to call it history, because folks sort of then are like, well, it's interesting to learn about that. It's an interesting historical footnote, rather than saying this shapes every moment of every single one of our lives here. And there can never be true justice until this history is reckoned with, until this history is reimagined, and until real justice is instituted here. And so, I think the other lesson that is perhaps less positive is just really how important it is, when we are talking about this history, to not let folks just push it into the past as if it has nothing to do with today, or allow them to reinterpret this history. I think one, really important thing that, I knew, but doing this work has really driven home, and especially doing the work around alternatives to incarceration, is understanding that it's not enough just to present facts to people, because the reality is we're all given this same framework, and people will unconsciously even distort facts or dismiss facts if they don't fit that larger framework that folks are given. There's a great article called Loot or Find, Fact or Frame by Carbati and Harris, and they have a line that says, frame trumps fact. And I, really root in that. The frames that we're given about life trump facts. And so it's necessary to challenge that larger frame. It's not enough to just say Oregon had multiple Black exclusion laws. I thought it was at the beginning. I was like, this history speaks for itself. And when I developed the timeline, I was like, do I even need to do a program? Because, people will just read this and they'll know, why am I here? And very quickly I was like, oh no, I absolutely need to be here. What are y'all doing? But it's, again, it's not even something, we can talk about the people who are maliciously and purposefully, and racistly trying to reinterpret this history. But I'm specifically talking about, especially, the well-meaning white people who are trying to understand, but are distorting this history to fit into the frames that they've been given. And so I very quickly realized my role is not just to present this history, but also to say, and these facts show us the larger frame, to make visible what has been invisibilized, so that folks can see that frame is still operating today. And you have to address and change these larger systemic realities to actually transform the future and build a different future than this past. So, you know, I think that's a big lesson. And I'm so excited that there are more and more people spreading this word around not only Oregon Black history, but the history of race, identity, and power in the Northwest. And it's incredibly important to make sure that we are interpreting this in a way that leads to action and real racial justice, because all of these pieces, unfortunately, can be reinterpreted in really, you know, at best misguided and at worst horrific and brutal ways.
And I love what you touched on there as far as like, especially in these last few years since, you know, getting involved with Respond to Racism LO, I've really become kind of just aware of, you know, this dynamic where it feels like, you know, even we're doing things that are, how do I put this, you know, they're not a performance, but they are a performance. Like by nature of being in front of a crowd, by nature of speaking to people, there's some level, and by nature of the fact that there's so many things competing for everyone's attention, we have to perform to some level. But, you know, kind of like you said, not just bringing the history there so people get the facts and then go home, because it just kind of becomes a show then. You know, how do you turn it into something that is actually, you know, again, moves people? How do you guide people that? And that's one of the things I've really appreciated about, you know, because I've been to multiple, you know, I've also been to some of your other, I don't think I've been to Alternatives to Prisons, but you were also doing one on history of hip hop and, you know, specifically around the book, you know, Can't Stop, Won't Stop. And for people on my Patreon will know I've kind of obsessed, but that's another story.
Yes, and I want to talk about it because I've loved watching that.
Yeah. But you know, so I've been to multiple like why there's so few Black people in Oregon presentations. And one of the things I think is so awesome about it is, yeah, you bring in the timeline, but everyone I've been to is different because it's really built on like the conversation, you know, the people who are there and kind of like what they latch on to. But then also, you know, again, you're not just there like, you know, a warm body presenting facts. Like you were very much intentional about being like, no, this is still happening. What are we doing? And yes, we are going to center Blackness. We are going to, like, this isn't just the, you know, Oregon, thank you for coming, white people. We are so glad you came. Can we give you some lemon water, whatever it is people drink, you know, like, and I, you know, again, that's it's just very important in terms of you know, adding something, making this more than just, for lack of better terms, just the trauma show, you know. And it, I don't know how to word this exactly, but I just like I said, I've become more kind of aware where it just feels like, are people coming here to like check this off the list? Are some people like, again, they're well intentioned, but if it doesn't go past the trauma show, at what point do I start questioning like, have we just found a new thing to consume? And it's, you know, and these are challenging questions. We all, you know, we're trying to figure it out in real time. Like you said, you started out thinking, if I just, these facts speak for themselves, I just present them, but then, you know, you get new information and it changes. So, you know, it's hard evolving work, which not so seamlessly transitions into other, talking about visionary fiction. And, you know, again, I was saying earlier in the interview, as far as like just like ideas that I think you've really like kind of like put into my consciousness. So I was interviewing you when you and you and Adrienne Marie Brown were releasing Octavia's Brood, and really just talking about this idea of visionary fiction. Could you just like one kind of like, what would your definition of visionary fiction be first off?
Yeah, I mean, I think just before we move on to visionary fiction, I just wanted to, just absolutely echo and support and underline that idea you're saying of like that going I definitely never wanted going to my programs to be like the checklist where it's like, yep, check, know about Black people now, and check, or worse, know about all people of color, because I went to an hour-and-a-half program on Oregon Black history. And I think, that's why I'm always excited to be working with and partnering with organizations that are actually doing on the ground work. So that's why I loved the tours with the Rural Organizing Project, who are an incredible organization, working across the state in rural areas on a number of different issues, but rooting their work in anti-racism. And so, when I did the tour with them, I would do my program, and then they would have an organizing meeting set up, a few days later, and they would be signing people up, and they'd be like, all right, how are we going to change this? And, we built in 30 minutes at the end for them to lead a section about what does this history mean for us in whatever community we were in. So to have this, I really hope that this is a catalyst for change. I want, when people learn this history, again, it's sort of like, if you don't know, you can't be held accountable for that. But once you know, or once you had the opportunity to know and you purposely chose not to know, then you are culpable. And so, I just want to say, doing the program with you and Respond to Racism, I was so, excited and happy because, the work that you were doing, the work your whole family is doing is just, building that Black leadership and vision. And it's so invaluable. And so I just think it's, the way that I do this work is absolutely about centering Black folks and of course other people of color as active change makers and not passive victims. And so, as you're saying, what has been done to us is horrific. But to me, even more importantly, is that under the worst of conditions, Black folks have not only survived in a place we were never meant to be, we have changed it for the better over and over and over again, regardless of the circumstances. I mean, Blackness is visionary in and of itself, and Blackness in Oregon it's incredible whenever I think about it. We were never supposed to be here. Multiple laws were passed. We were told we would be tortured publicly. And yet not only did we stay, we built, we transformed, we created more justice for everyone over and over and over again. And, you and your family are part of that legacy as well. And so I'm just thankful for the visionary organizing and leadership of folks doing that work on the ground. And that's what I hope my presentation and my program always supports. I don't want people to just come and go, it's white people. Let's be clear. Black folks can come and do whatever they want, but white people cannot come and be, oh, that was interesting. And that's it. Like, now now you're responsible. So either do something or be honest that you don't want to do anything, but you can no longer lie to yourself and say that you believe in justice when I presented you with a list of 100 organizations doing work, in the community across the state. You need to do something, whatever it is.
Yeah, I mean, literally at your presentations, for those who haven't been, you provide a list, you put it up on the big screen, like you have multiple accessible ways for people to directly get in touch with organizations in their area that are doing the work. And so it's always funny to me when, because again, we'll talk about the white people in the room who will, during the Q&A time, be like, so what can I do? There's a list literally on the table in front of them. There is again, that same list is on the big PowerPoint screen behind you. You have told them multiple times, I will be directing you to this list. There will be a portion of the section. And then you will say that again, because you're just professional and polite at this point. And then right after that person asks that question, another person will get up and be like, okay, but as a white man, what can I do? And just like, again, you're better than me, because I imagine after a while, it's just like an urge to just like leap over like tables and chairs, just be like, you're not listening. Are you messing with me? What is going on?
Yeah. When I think that idea, like, again, it's important for me, for white folks to know when they say, especially, the thing, especially you're talking about is like, I have just, you just encountered this information for the first time. We're not even halfway done with the program. And so I say, what about the timeline is interesting to you? Where do you want to dig deeper? Where do you want to get more information? What conversations do you want to have? And that's often when someone will be like, well, what can we do? And I'm like, I'm going to just take you that you are not trying to be disruptive and you actually want to do something, which sometimes is a very generous gift. But what it does is it erases the need for white folks to learn, right? It's a very kind of colonial mentality, because it's as if there's no more information for them to learn, like that there isn't masses of complex, nuanced, layered, beautiful history and scholarship by Black people that they need to engage in. And it also is a colonial mentality as if nothing else is happening, right? Oh, y'all knew about this and you didn't do anything? Well, I guess I'll have to come in and fix it, And I'm like, we're not asking you to Superman us. Thank you. Please stop. And so for me, I think it's, again, my program is an hour and a half or 2 hours. So I'm like, what you can do is listen and engage with this history for 2 hours and get the barest minimum foundation. I've spent I've spent about 15 years of my life studying this, and that's nothing compared to some, elders who have spent decades, 50, 60, 70 years or more doing this work. So I'm like, there's a lot to learn here. But, also just recognizing the need to shift the frame, because that mentality erases the fact that Black people have always been the leaders on this, that we should be centered, that our voices, our visions, and leadership should be centered in any movement, because we are the ones who have been holding this and doing this work. And we have created countless resources to not only learn about it, but also countless resources saying this is what needs to happen. This is what needs to change. Like the State of Black Oregon report, which is, invaluable, even though the last full one came out a few years ago. I'm like, if we worked on enacting all of those policies and, proposals, let's just do that then. Or, I direct people to Imagine Black's People's Plan that came out when they were the Portland African American Leadership Forum, before they changed their name to Imagine Black, which, again, I'm like, if we just enacted what was in here, we've been putting out reports. If we enacted reports that the NAACP put out in 1926, we would be ahead of the game. So, for me, asking that question before you've actually listened, what it does is it erases the fact that Black folks have not only been living this, but we have been experts on this, and we have been putting out plans for change that, again, even if they're 80 years old, if we enacted those today, it would make the Portland and Oregon and the world a billion times better. And so that's just always, I'm like, if you didn't know this is what you're doing, I just want you to know, by asking that question at this moment, this is what you're doing. And when they then ask it again, I'm like, okay, now it's no longer you're no longer innocently asking this.
It's an interesting irony. It's like, you literally came to a presentation to listen to a Black woman, and you are in real time just demonstrating your either inability or unwillingness to listen to a Black woman. Yeah, but you kind of touched on it there again, as far as like the idea of visionary fiction, the fact that, you know, Black people have been kind of like imagining, you know, out of necessities, like different realities, and documenting and putting out the plans, putting out the frameworks, you know, have been putting out these visions of it. And like I said, I remember when I was interviewing you for Octavia's Brood, you know, just really stuck with me. You said, like, you know, like abolitionists back in the days of like slavery in America, like that was visionary fiction. Can you just, yeah, I guess I want to just talk a little bit more about visionary fiction is kind of like a practice, but then also talk about like some of the work you've been doing around it, like obviously Octavia's Brew, but then also like workshops. And yeah, can you just expound upon that a little bit more?
Sure. Yeah. So I started using the term visionary fiction to talk about the intersections of social change and science fiction, which I think are absolutely interconnected. The definition I use of visionary fiction is that it's fantastical art that helps us to understand existing power dynamics and helps us to imagine ways to build better futures. So it is really about imaginative, fantastical, visionary spaces that allow us to start with the question, what is the world that we want? And it is really, it's not utopian because it's more interested in how do we build that world into existence? What do we need to do? It's intricately and intimately tied with community organizing, with social justice movements, with liberation movements. And so, you know, for me, sort of the culmination of that thinking was the anthology I co-edited with Adrienne Maree Brown, Octavia's Brood, Science Fiction Stories from Social Justice Movements, where we brought together organizers, activists, and change makers to write science fiction and fantastical stories that helped us to imagine building different worlds. So, you know, a number of the folks had written science fiction before, and some are well known, like LeVar Burton or Tananarive Due or Terry Bisson, but a number of those folks had never written fiction, let alone science fiction. But we absolutely believed that they would write incredible pieces that helped us to imagine something different, because the premise of Octavia's Brood, and really the premise of visionary fiction, is that all organizing is science fiction. So every time we imagine a world without prisons, without borders, without these oppressions we're fighting against, that's science fiction, because we've never seen that world. But we can't build what we can't imagine. So we absolutely need imaginative spaces like science fiction that allow us to throw out everything we've been told is realistic. Because it's very important to recognize reform or realistic change is what a system will allow to change that keeps it functioning business as usual. So reform is really a mechanism of social control. It's like a release valve for systems of inequality that says we can let them let off a little steam, we can make some changes, but we can keep the engine functioning as normal. Whereas real substantive social change was always, the people seeking it were always told it was an impossibility because it would fundamentally transform systems. And obviously systems don't want to be fundamentally transformed for the better. And so, you know, for myself and for Adrienne, my co-editor, you know, as two Black women, we absolutely root in the fact that our enslaved Black ancestors, to me, were the most ingenious and courageous sci-fi creators ever, because they dreamed of a world without slavery. And everything in this world, in these power systems, told them that's an impossibility. They were told they could get reform. And I mean, you know, if we want to look at the absurdity of reform, looking back at the reforms that were offered in response to slavery, right? The idea that you can make a kinder, gentler slavery, and that the majority of white people thought that that was possible. They were either fine with slavery continuing, or they thought, well, yes, but we need a little tinkering with this. But Black folks rejected that entirely and said, if you're telling this is a fantasy, then we're going to dream impossible dreams, and we will change the entire world if necessary to make them reality. And that's exactly what they did. You know, no one ended, you know, we celebrated Juneteenth not that long ago, and Juneteenth is about the power and the courage and determination of enslaved Black folks to fundamentally change this nation. This nation would have allowed slavery to continue forever, except for the will of enslaved Black folks. And that is what Juneteenth celebrates. It doesn't celebrate Abraham Lincoln or any white man, certainly not that white man who was an incredibly racist, horrific white man, but no white man, not even John Brown, who was a lovely, wonderful, courageous white man who I respect very much. But it was the will of enslaved Black folks who imagined impossible dreams and then changed everything. And so to me, those are the histories that we root in when we're talking about visionary fiction. We root in the experiences and the work of marginalized and oppressed communities of color, and understand that true liberation is about centering those folks who have been pushed to the margins. If it's not centering decolonized dreams from communities of color, then it's not a visionary or liberated future.
Yeah, you know, that's reminds me of, I think the first time I interviewed you, because it's for a story on this group, Decolonized PDX. And, you know, when we talk about kind of like that idea of, you know, pushing back against quote unquote like realistic change, and, you know, what is reform versus abolition. Because I know, like, when you all were talking about this idea of abolishing prisons, you know, my instinct was like, okay, this sounds good, but so what is the alternative? What is, you know, what is the, so what do we do in place? Like, you know, the typical question, yeah, so, okay, but what about murderers? You know, what about the predators? Like, what we got to do, you know, and just thinking about it, I know, like, at that time, it was really, I was thinking about kind of like in this binary thing. And I know what I've kind of like picked up over the years anyway, is that, oh, this is messy. Like, that's what it is. Like, it's a process. It's messy. It's, you know, what we do know is what's happening right now is not going to work. There's, you know, like you said, like even like people would advocate for, if it wasn't for us, you know, people would be advocating for just a kinder, gentler slavery that lasted forever. So how do you translate that into, you know, I think about it now because that Decolonized PDX interview was, I want to say, 2012, 2013. And now, you know, we're in a thing where the idea, maybe it's not, you know, it doesn't poll well or whatever, but the idea of defunding the police, the idea of abolishing the police, these are mainstream discussions at the very least. Maybe they're not quote unquote popular, but they are very much, you know, like they are discussions at the forefront. They are, you know, things that come up in, you know, these political debates, and people have to address them, which means, like, you know, that's a tangible, even just over several years, that's a tangible change you can see. And I'm just curious, like, you know, again, you've kind of talked about it, just like this is kind of like the legacy, but around, especially around like police and prison abolition, just can you just talk about, in your eyes, how you've seen the conversation change, just like I said, evolve and change in these last several years, and I guess just like how you feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, it's important. I think it's important to start in that history. And, you know, for me, you know, we can talk about this later, but, you know, I really have been moving towards trying to, you know, challenge and reject linear time, this separation between the past, the present, and the future. Because, you know, folks are often like, wait, you're a futurist, but you also are a historian. And to me, I'm like, I am studying how folks build just worlds. And it doesn't matter if it's the past, the present, or the future. In terms of, it's not like I look at it and I'm like, oh, I only want to look backwards. I'm studying how these things happen. And it makes sense to be looking kind of full circle 360 degrees at that. So, to me, it's incredibly important to look historically for so many reasons. But I think one of them is that one that you're talking about is this sort of the long memory and the long view of history, is recognizing that if we're only focused in this moment, things seem complex, right? That, oh, there are so many different sides and different pieces and different voices. But when we take a historical view, when we look at the long view, the issue of, specifically of slavery in this country at the time, again, people were like, it's so complex. Now, I feel like anyone who has a conscience looks back and says, this was a unjust, immoral, brutal, horrific system that should never have existed. And dear God, why did it take so long to end it? Right? There is no, well, let's talk about the complexities. There's a right side and a wrong side. And looking at that through that lens allows you to see, I would have wanted to be on the right side of history. And so I think part of my work of futurism is about extending history forward, about seeing this moment through a historical lens. In 100 years, in 200 years, I fundamentally and absolutely believe that future societies will look back and say, how could they have allowed incarcerations and the carceral system, A, to exist at all, and B, to exist for so long? How could they have done that to themselves and their society? I think there will be a wrong and a right side of history. And I think those folks who are opposing prisons and policing, that are calling for abolition, which is about creating community-based systems of justice and accountability, about addressing the institutional and systemic inequalities in society, they will fundamentally be on the right side of history. And so I think that sort of long historical view is useful for us in the present to project forward and say, what will they think about us? And I don't need people in 100 years to know my name, but I do want to be part of a movement that they remember and that they say, it was because of them that everything changed for the better. And I think, to me, that's the question we should each be asking ourselves is, in what MLK called the long arc of justice, where are you going to stand when that, I want to fall under the shadow of justice. And so I'm going to do everything within my power to do that. And so, I think it's that piece is important. I also think it's important for folks to know that this notion of abolition of the police and prisons and the entire carceral system, right? Because police and prisons are the most outward manifestations of a carceral system, of a system that relies on the notion of punishment, of dehumanization, of control, of exploitation. But it's not enough just to eliminate police and prisons explicitly. With technology, we could conceivably, within our lifetimes, eliminate prisons and place everyone who would be incarcerated under electronic surveillance. That, to me, is not abolition, and it's certainly not justice. So it's important for us to both challenge the physical institutions, but it's also important for us to challenge the larger ideology, because that's how we got the prison system, is that slavery morphed into the prison system as a method of controlling potentially rebellious communities, specifically recently freed Black communities. And so, it's important to attack the core of that, because I think this nation is the most adept at responding and transforming itself while keeping this sort of core of white supremacist heteropatriarchal capitalism intact. And so we have to be prepared that the system will reimagine itself, but it will not do so willingly reimagine itself as a just system. That is something that we are going to have to, through our own power do. And I think we are seeing that happening now. And so, specifically talking about abolishing prisons and police, it's important to note we've been having those conversations in the US for decades. You can go back to the Black Panther Party, and their 10-point platform talked about abolition of prisons and abolition of police. You can see that through, the 80s and especially the 90s, and that work being led, especially by women of color and, trans and non-binary folks of color, through organizations like, Insight and Critical Resistance. So, it's important, I think, for folks to know that this is not something new, and it's not something folks haven't not only thought about, but been implementing. Folks have been implementing for decades, for centuries, ways to hold accountable those who do harm, ways to address harm, ways to keep each other safe outside of these carceral systems. So I think it's important to see that long history. And it's also important to give all love and respect and credit to the courageous folks who have been out on these streets for, well over a year in the midst of a pandemic and all of the devastation and horror that has wrought on so many different levels, facing down the immense brutality of, the police everywhere, especially here in Portland. That they're not only being in the streets, but saying, we have tried every reform you have offered us, and it has not changed how the police interact with us. So we have to imagine something completely different. We have to defund the police. We have to take that money and move it into actually addressing the concerns and the needs of these historically exploited communities. And, that work has been led by Black people and especially Black youth, again, around the world, in the US and here in Portland. And so it's, it's incredibly important. And they accomplished something that I, who have been an abolitionist for, well over a decade, I consider to be a fantasy. If you would have asked me, 3 years ago, when will we be talking about abolishing police in the mainstream in the United States as a serious concern, as you were saying, I would have said, maybe 20 years, maybe 30 years, fingers crossed. And then I woke up overnight and it's like Black youth were like, you late, we doing it, get on board. I was like, wait, hold up, wait for me. So, it's both this, it's this long history, and it's the incredible vision and courageous organizing of, Black folks in this moment and in this movement, and Black youth, especially in this moment and movement, who are like, we're not waiting anymore. And, we have taken and done everything the system told us to do, and it has not changed anything. And so we will, like our ancestors, dream impossible dreams, and we will reimagine the entire world if necessary to create a space where we can live free and whole.
Yeah, and you talked about just that other part of the work, as far as like beyond abolishing systems, creating community-based systems. And I find just like, again, talking about just like the messiness of abolition sometimes, which is like, it's interesting. We talk about historically, it's the youth who usually are moving, when we look back, it's the youth moving a lot of these movements, shifting the needle a lot of times. But then we also talk about kind of like, I guess like difficulties, whether it's, generationally or across other, identifiers, in terms of like really building community. And, what I would just like pose to you, as far as like, especially like if you were talking to like younger people, because on one hand, you talk about as far as them being able to like get things done that you thought were a fantasy. And I can just go back to my time being that age. I wasn't doing that, but you know, I definitely know I'd be moving with Simon as you're like, okay, so what can you tell me then? If I did this thing that you couldn't conceive of, what do you have for me? And I kind of find that in just a lot of interactions, it's, you know, like the bigger picture, it's the I guess it's like the nuts and bolts of this, like the actual like community building, the actual like connection part, where we're not just moving together on when it's easy, but we're, you know, we're able to struggle and still move together when it's hard. Like, do you have, as far as just like advice, especially for younger people, kind of in that space in dealing with that?
I mean, I guess I just also want to say, like, I think, you know, it's a yes and, right? I mean, my co-editor Adrian always talks about how do we say yes and rather than no but. Like, systems of hierarchy always rely on dichotomy, right? It's black or it's white, which means, you know, both can't be true, and it blocks out the like countless other colors that exist as well, right? And so, you know, I think it's important again to just recognize, like, there are folks who have been holding abolition for decades, and it is also absolutely this current movement and moment of young people saying, we are not going to accept this notion of reform from these systems anymore. It's a yes and we, you know, I just feel like part of the notion of generational divide is about not being able to acknowledge what everyone is bringing to the table as well, and to, you know, to accept it. It's like, well, who makes change? It's like, we all make. What are you talking about? Like, you know, that notion of I versus we, right? Like, that's a very, it's a capitalist, white supremacist Western notion. And most of our communities of color, you know, are not rooted in like, it's either you or me. It's like, it's we, it's all of us. Why would we even waste our time arguing about this? So, you know, I think it's important to, you know, to be able to hold that, and to hold, like, you know, elders and other folks who are not necessarily elders have been holding this work for a really long time, and youth are absolutely moving this work forward, and all of that is true, and it's how we win, right? Is all of us coming together with a shared vision. And I think, you know, that piece of like, how do we build community, I think it is important to think about and talk about what is our shared vision of liberation. And then, you know, and Adrian talks a lot about this in her book, Emergent Strategy, which is about not just creating kind of set strategic plans for campaigns, but rather thinking holistically about how do we want to be? How do we want to be as a whole, not just in this campaign for the next 6 months? How do we want to be for the rest of our lives all together? And so she talks about how do we develop shared principles and values and a shared vision, rather than just like, here's an organizing goal, here are the steps to it. And again, we can do that. We need to do that in some cases, obviously. But I think that those larger conversations are often ones we don't have. And I think it's really important, because I think when we have those conversations ahead of time, in sort of like in private, without pressure on us to make a choice, then it allows us to see, like, yes, we are going to have differences. And that's the reality. It's always been that way. There are going to be some of us who want to do different tactics and strategies. There are going to be places where we just don't agree. It's important for us to know that ahead of time, so that it's not something that's exploited and used against us later by the forces that we are actually all opposed to. And so, you know, I always tell folks, every successful movement has a multiplicity of strategies and tactics. And yet, you know, because of hierarchy, we are pitted against each other and told like there can only be, it's like Highlander, there can be only one, right? Like only one tactic can be right, and therefore the rest are wrong. Rather than saying like, how about every tactic or strategy based in principle and with our shared values that moves us closer to freedom is right. And so if you want to take that road, like what can I do to support you on the way? And at the very least, I'm not going to kick rocks under your feet as you're walking on that path. So, you know, I think it's, to me, that is one of the biggest things about building community, is about having those hard conversations ahead of time. I think we don't want to have them because they're uncomfortable, and because, you know, we like to imagine we're all going to agree on everything. But I think it's important to recognize that's not what, to me, that's not what liberation looks like, is all of us agreeing on everything, because liberation is about all of us being able to be our full selves. To me, it's about acting with integrity and principle. And so being able to talk to you and we have a conversation, I'm like, oh, we actually really disagree on some parts of this plan or this idea or this vision. That's good to know. And so later on, when it comes up, I'm like, I already know how so-and-so feels about that because we've had that conversation. So I can come to you and be like, hey, we've reached this moment. Here are some ideas about what we can do. Or we can just say, hey, now maybe it's time for us to part ways and I wish you the best of luck. But it's not going to be something that blows up and tears us apart and is weaponized against us. And to me, I think that, you know, talking about the history and the future, that is one of the biggest lessons to learn from history, is the ways that our differences get weaponized against us. And for the Black struggle, we've seen it again and again and again, that white oppressive systems of power will weaponize any difference to tear us apart. And I feel like, you know, as someone who has had the honor of learning from former Black Panther Party members, I feel like so many of them are like, if you learn no other lesson from the party, learn the lesson of not letting the ideological differences you have be used to divide you and to turn against one another by these systems. And I feel like we have to create spaces in our movements to be human. You know, you talk about being messy. I think it's just being human. We are messy and we're brilliant and we're sometimes horrific and we're incredible. And we have to create movements that allow us to be human. We have to create movements that can hold us when we're at our worst, not just at our best, because that is what it is to be human. And if we don't create movements to do that, then we're not actually building towards those liberated futures that we want to see.
Amen. Amen. You know, kind of with that in mind, we're gonna kind of wrap this up, or at least this portion of the interview up. But I just want to, you know, you've got, obviously, you talk about PSU, but you also constantly busy with projects. So I just want to give you an opportunity to, you know, plug what else you got going on. Yeah, can you just tell people, you know, what upcoming projects you're working on, you know, where they can find you on the interwebs and all that stuff people do at the end of podcasts.
Yeah, well, folks can find me on, you know, the Instagram and the Twitter and the Facebook, Walidah Imarisha. My website is walidah.com. And yeah, you know, I post up when I'm doing events and about different things I'm working on. You know, one really important project that I'm honored to be part of is working with the Keaton Otis Memorial Art Project. And Keaton Otis was a young Black man who was murdered by Portland police in 2010. His father, Fred Bryant, started a monthly vigil at the spot at Northeast 6th and Halsey to honor his son. And every month it has happened since 2010 for over 11 years now. And Fred Bryant unfortunately passed away because of the struggle to get justice for his son. But the community has continued to hold that monthly space. And now we're in a process with the Memorial Art Project to create some sort of way of physically honoring Keaton and just creating some sort of installation. And so we're engaged in a community-based process around that to get feedback from everyone to just make sure what we come up with really encapsulates both Keaton and Fred and this larger struggle for justice for those who have been taken from us by police violence here in Portland. So that's a community project I've been very excited about. And I, encourage folks, we're still having the monthly vigils, so they can look up Justice for Keaton Otis on Facebook and get information about the monthly vigils if they're interested in joining us and finding out more information about that. And then myself, I'm working on a film project that is very exciting. It's an abolitionist sci-fi / documentary hybrid film project. So it's set in a future world without prisons or police in an abolitionist future. And it follows a young person there who's creating a documentary about how abolition happened. So that is a project I'm so lucky and honored to be working with amazing people on: Calvin Williams, Jordan Flaherty, and Kate Turnbull, and we're working together, or Trumbull, working together to bring this film to life. So, really just thinking about how to make abolition seem possible and tangible to folks.
Any timeline on when this is supposed to come out, or it's still kind of like in the early stages?
Yeah. We're hoping I'm not gonna TBD. I'll let people know as soon as it's ready. I'll be shouting it from the mountains. So
well, I'll definitely be on the lookout. Walidah, thank you again for taking the time today. It's always great talking to you, and best of luck just doing a bunch of awesome things.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bruce. I really appreciate this space that you've created in general, and just the thoughtfulness you bring to the sort of journalism and the interviews and just the spaces of interrogation you create. So I'm really thankful. And
thank you for watching. Please like and share and subscribe so you can stay up to date on all the latest videos. Thank you.